the academic podcast agency.
Hello, and welcome to the Ways of Knowing podcast.
I'm Jamie Barnes, and I am a sociologist and an anthropologist. I work at the University of Sussex.
And my name's Will Hood, and I am the creative director of the academic podcast agency. And this is a piece that Jamie and I are putting together, which really wants to explore the idea that there are multiple ways of knowing the same subject matters.
When you go outside of your area of expertise and you try to know what it's like to be a badger and you start trying to live like a badger, you begin to appreciate just what the capabilities are of a badger and how limited one's own capabilities are as a human being.
We'll discuss further ideas about knowing badgers later on in this episode. But for now, our journey starts at Wakehurst, Kew's wild botanic garden in Sussex. Jamie, why are we here?
Okay, so Wakehurst has been managed by Royal Botanic Gardens Kew since the mid-1960s. And today they have maybe, 600 scientists working for Kew. And quite a few of them are based at Wakehurst. They also have teams of people communicating with a wider audience about the scientific work that they're doing there. One of these people is Becca Roberts.
We have different plots. They're across different habitats, and those plots will literally be there forever. That's the joy of having Wakehurst.
And when I talked to Becca, she explained to me how the scientific team at Wakehurst are conceptualising the landscape there as a living laboratory.
By monitoring everything, we can then provide really, really high-resolution detail on how temperature might influence greenhouse gas flux, for example, and answer loads of really cool questions.
Now, whilst the concept of a living laboratory is a really exciting way to understand a landscape that is clearly brimming with life, as an anthropologist, one understands that this scientific way of knowing a landscape or place is just one way of knowing. And the different measurements that are going on, the different ways in which the scientists are engaging with that as a place, that is just one way of knowing Wakehurst. Any particular place is not just one thing, but it is many things, depending upon the experience and the perspective of the being that is knowing it.
And so when we're talking about ways of knowing, we're not necessarily talking about human ways of knowing. And this has been a subject of Jamie's research for quite a long time now.
I'm particularly interested in phenomenology, which is interested in how living beings experience the world. And I'm interested in not only how humans experience the world, but I'm interested in how other species experience the world as well. So thinking about animals, plants as well, fungi.
Okay, so phenomenology.
Phenomenology.
A large word that distilled is really talking about experience, right? But
yes.
Subjective experience.
Subjective experience, yes.
And so before we dig down into the bones of it, I'm wondering what subjective experience you would like the listeners of this show to have by the time we're finished.
Just spend an hour with your face in the soil and it will change you. Get down, get your head down next to the earth and just spend time. Don't know, you don't know what's going to happen, but it changes you. The project at Wakehurst started a couple of years ago when a group of us were invited from the University of Sussex to explore collaborations with Wakehurst and with Kew. And the folks at Wakehurst there put on an incredibly impressive day, showing us around, telling us about the different science that's going on there, showing us the Millennium Seed Bank, where they store all of these seeds from around the world. And the impression that I had for coming away from that day was just the kind of weight and the value and the impressiveness of scientific knowledge. So whether it's measuring gas exchange between soils or whether it's biological recording of different species within that particular landscape. Essentially, what those people are trying to do is gather data that then can form this bigger picture that looks at not only what's going on in Sussex, but also what's going on in the UK, and how that can then be scaled up to an understanding of whatever is being measured on a more global scale. So within the sort of scientific endeavour, those people are working as individuals, but they're working towards this bigger project of knowledge and understanding.
Is there an ecological perspective to this? Is there an idea that actually through understanding that we can protect and we can encourage a better biodiversity, which is understood to be beneficial to us? I mean, is that one of the angles or the angle?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. So I spent a weekend with a whole number of different voluntary biological recording groups. Firstly, to see whether there was the presence or absence of particular species within that landscape, but also then they would also want to know population sizes.
This is ancient meadow as far back as records go. Yeah.
And how far back is that? The record?
I've been told 1,000 years.
Wow.
Really?
Okay.
But I don't know how they recorded that. Maybe in the Doomsday Book.
It's got to be.
Yeah.
Times maps. And
Yeah. So yeah.
So this is a meadow that's been around for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
The biological recording groups that I spent the weekend with, they're part of these recording groups, these societies. Yeah, they're not being paid. Go around and in their own time recording whether species are present or absent and population sizes.
But there are some of the common species that are easy, or you can learn them very quickly to identify them. The problem being that the experts ignore them because they're common.
Okay.
Got up quite early. We were out quite early, springtime, so it was sort of a nice day, but wasn't very warm in certain areas. Richard Dawson, that I spent the day with, looking for these little tiny little solitary minor bees.
To encourage people that they can make a difference and they can.
I'm following Richard around and he's sort of saying, okay, well, yeah, this is just not warm enough in this area of woodland at the moment. Oh, but there's a bit of dappled light coming through in this other section. That would be the kind of area we might see a few bees beginning to circulate in that kind of area.
Sort of ecological conditions, habitat and things like that are really important.
And bees need a certain warmth in order to be able to function and to get their bodies moving, their wings moving, and to be able to fly.
So what is it that you think people are getting out of that experience? I mean, it's physical labour, isn't it? I mean, they're not digging ditches in the snow, but they are out there for hours, walking around, looking for things. They're physically exerting themselves in the world.
I think it depends on who you talk to, but certainly with the people that I spent time with, I think many of them from early childhood had a kind of fascination in ecology and other species and a delight in kind of recording things and of identifying stuff, just a real pleasure in doing that.
So Richard, this world of biological recording, you only really started to get into this a few years ago.
As a kid, obsessed with out and about and the woodlands and looking at things and that, and then real life gets in the way. You're told to work hard at school and get a proper job. I think if I'd known as a kid that this was a viable career, I probably would have gone that way, but I was always obsessed and interested in the climbing was very much part of that, getting out and seeing different environments and different places.
So Jamie, am I right in thinking that whilst you really do respect the scientific work that is being done there at Wakehurst, it's the experience of those involved that you're most interested in? The experience of the biological recorders, but also the experience of what they're recording. Is that right? Something like that?
Wakehurst as a place is not just, as it's being described by the scientific team, as a living laboratory. That's just one conceptualization and one experience of that landscape. In fact, from the perspective of a grass snake or a solitary minor bee, it's not a living laboratory at all. It's something quite different. So it's really that idea about how a place is not one thing, but many things, depending upon the experience and the perspective of the bodied being that's knowing it.
Okay, so this is absolutely a fascinating question, and I suppose I'm now wondering exactly how crazy it is to think that anyone could understand the lived experience of a non-human animal. And so I'm thinking a dog. Well, yes, I've shared many important life memories with dogs. Cats, less so, but other people have intense relationships with cats. But once you start talking about insects or vegetation, I mean, is that really a meaningful question? Jamie, you shared with me recently an amazing piece of ethnographic work that you did back in 2017 called A Day with a Tree. And perhaps we'll link to this in the show notes because it's extremely charming. But the question that you posit in that work is it possible through a period of short but intense ethnographic field work and the subsequent reflections it engenders to imaginatively enter the world of a tree? Tell us about your day with a tree.
As an anthropologist, I have been familiar with doing field work and doing ethnography where you spend a period of time usually with a particular group of people, a long period of time, and you try to understand the world from their point of view, from their lived experience. And it interested me a few years ago to see if that would be possible to use that methodology to spend time not with humans, but to spend time with the more than human world. And so I decided to spend 24 hours with a tree. And very, very quickly, it struck me that there were similarities and there were differences between myself and this other thing that I was trying to understand.
So I want to push back in a playful way.
Yeah.
To really speak to the voice of anybody listening to this that may have the thought, what on earth is this man talking about? Of course, he is very different from a tree. He's a man, the tree's a tree. What is it that you hoped to get from that experience?
If you start to think, okay, phenomenologically, it's possible to know and describe one's own experience. It's very difficult to know the experience of another being, even if that other being is a human being. Then if one takes that to thinking about how other species experience the world, sounds like a crazy question until you ask it and then think, well, what is it experiencing at this particular moment? Am I so restricted in thinking about the term experience that I can only relate that to human experience? And of course, I'm aware as much as anybody that a tree is a very different thing to me. But the art of ethnography and of participating with this particular being is to unpack, well, in what ways is it similar and in what ways is it different?
You're putting in some work there, aren't you? It's not just a casual thought and then you've spent 20 minutes stroking a tree and going, oh, the bark feels nice or whatever. You're spending 24 hours in contemplation of this tree with the understanding that you are stuck, for want of a better word, as you, that you can't climb outside of you and become the tree. Yeah. But nevertheless, you're going to give it your attention for 24 hours.
Yeah.
You seem to be saying that by making earnest and committed effort to understand the experience of this tree, it seriously and for the benefit changes your own experience of yourself.
Yeah. you could dismiss the exercise and by highlighting that that's a negative thing, that it just folds back and it's basically just exploring the experience of what it's like to be human. But I think it's an unfair dismissal.
Because there's a transformation that takes place in your experience of what it is to be a human.
Yes, and in your experience of what it is to be human, actually, I mean, I only spent 24 hours with that tree, and that was like 8 years ago. But it has profoundly reshaped my orientation in the world. And it's changed the way that I think about other species. It's changed me.
But what is that in you that wants to break through that membrane that separates you from it?
Gosh, that's such a good question. And I don't really know the answer. But I know that there's a great deal of pleasure in the journey towards that. We are surrounded by differences, by life forms which are different from ourselves. And, okay, I don't know whether the blue cedar is curious about me, but I know that I'm curious about the blue cedar. And therefore, it's in my human capacity to explore that and to be curious and to explore that mystery.
We should talk about our visit to see the unique and eccentric nature writer, Charles Foster.
Yeah.
You've got me reading his book, Being a Beast, which is absolutely amazing. And I've got a Post-it note in front of me, and which I've scribbled down a couple of weeks ago. I was a lump of idling software in a box made of meat, which is a great phrase, great mental imagery, and very much in keeping with the tone of his writing. And for people listening to this, Charles Foster, he basically attempts to the best of his ability to live as a number of animals for a period of time, with the full understanding that this is impossible, possibly stupid, and in some cases perhaps illegal. It's a very, very good read. But the self-depreciation is not only about his inability to carry out this physical thought experiment, but it's also, interestingly, in this sense that human beings on their own are lacking.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Charles Foster's self-depreciation is also of a particular type. But in the book, he goes back to some early childhood experiences where he describes walking out of the village or the town where he's living into the darkness, and he's experiencing the darkness and the mystery of something else, an other world that is present there, that he's on the fringes of, this more than human world. But he is also engaging in this journey which is deeply humbling.
Hi,
welcome.
Charles.
You Will.
I am Will. Nice to meet you.
Jamie.
Hi, I'm Jamie.
Hi, good to see you.
Please
welcome to this
Thank you.
mad, rather squalid house. I'm Charles Foster. I write books. I do academic things in the University of Oxford. I'm married to a wonderful woman called Mary. I have 6 more or less unruly children. So I grew up in Sheffield, in Yorkshire. Our house had a privet hedge around it, and in that privet hedge there nested a blackbird. I was a passionate boyhood naturalist, and I looked at stuff. But this bird did something which really unnerved me. I was used to looking at stuff. This bird looked at me, and it plainly knew something about my domain that I didn't know. And that infuriated me. But its knowledge, both of the place and of me, unnerved me. And so I set about trying to find out what it knew. And I tried lots of conventional things. So when I came home from school, I went round the blackbirds' nests in the area, writing down details of what eggs were there and what fledglings were there in my little notebook. I mapped the flight paths of blackbirds across the garden. I collected little fragments of eggshell. And then I did things which probably sound to you to be really perverted, but in fact are absolutely standard shamanic practice for almost all human beings that there have ever been. So, for example, I scraped a dead blackbird off the road. I mounted it with its wings outspread, suspended on a thread over my bed. So the very last thing I saw before going to sleep was this bird, hoping that some of the knowledge this bird had would float down to me in the night. I pickled its brain in formalin and went to sleep holding it, hoping that some of the knowledge of this creature would seep out through my hand into me. And of course it failed, but it seeded in me a desire, which I think we all have, to know whether we are locked up forever in the lonely echo chamber, which is our own skull, or if it's possible in any way to get outside our own heads.
I want to talk specifically about Being a Beast from 2015. In the book, you took it upon yourself to try and live as 5 different animals: the badger, the otter, the urban fox, the red deer, and the swift. Can you tell us a little bit about your methodology in this and just describe what you were thinking for someone that wouldn't have read the book?
So Being a Beast is an attempt to inhabit the sensory worlds of creatures that are in some ways very different from me, and in some ways very closely akin to me. And it's only a few million years since I was related to these other species. The method was an extravagant, probably ludicrous zoological method acting. So the process was I get hold of all the scientific papers I can find, which tell me how these animals' sensory receptors worked and how the information gathered by these sensory receptors is processed centrally. And then having got all this information, I went out into the woods and the rivers and tried to occupy the space which these creatures occupy there. And that involved trying to pay attention in a way that I don't usually do to lots of different sensory modalities, which normally lie inert. A proper epistemology is not about knowing the facts about something, but being in a relationship with that thing. So I tried to pay attention to a slightly wider bandwidth.
So you and I believe your 8-year-old son, Tom, you spent a number of weeks living as badgers. Tell me about that.
Tom and I got on a train to Abergavenny and we were met by my friend Bert, who has a JCB. And he used that JCB to dig a hole in his wood and we covered it over and Tom and I lived there. We tried to keep badger hours, tried to keep badger level, so crawling around on hands and knees, so that our noses were nearer the ground, which is where badgers' noses are. In order to discover scent, it was a good way of disabling our eyes, because we were pushing all the time through bracken and grass. And of course it was dark most of the time anyway. Tom and I were getting a tiny fraction of the amount of sensation that a fully switched on badger in that wood would get. But we were soaking up sensation from the forest floor through our palms and our feet in the same way that a badger does. We were paying more attention to our noses than we normally do. We were shivering and cold. We did have a degree of uncertainty about where our next meal was going to come from, and that heightened our awareness of all the latency of that wood. And I compared that with all the certainties or presumed certainties of my life as a human. I was bowled over by the intensity of the badger's life and humiliated at the contrast between the intensity of that life with my own anemic life. We choose to construe the world based on just our vision, and our vision and our cognition are connected with one another. Add into that equation the cognitive distortion, the self-reverence which comes from the entanglement of vision and cognition. And we're left with the conclusion that we have no real idea of the sort of place that we occupy. No wonder we feel not at home in it. No wonder we're plagued by existential crisis. No wonder we've no idea not only what sort of place we live in, but what sort of creatures we are.
A proper epistemology, so a proper knowledge of something, is not just about knowing the facts, but about being in relation with that thing. That's what really stands out to me from that interview with Charles.
Yeah.
But to pick up on that, in previous conversations, you have talked about frontiers. And I think that's a particularly useful word here, because there clearly is a place or a frontier, whether physically or philosophically, where you can't either become a tree or become a badger or really understand what it is to be a badger or a tree. But presumably you can get closer than you might be to that point. Do you think it's a stretch to say that there's something ancient in us that yearns to do that?
I mean, I think certainly if you look at human history and you think of the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years that human beings have been doing that and of living with a deep awareness of their entanglement as another form of life amongst many other life forms, then I think the thing that then emerges out of that thought is how peculiar our own particular way of life is today. Yeah. So it's not so much saying, okay, this is kind of genetically programmed into us to find delight in this. I don't know about that. But, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But what we can say is that actually the way of life that you and I, the majority of us, live with is peculiar in the sense that we have separated ourselves and become less curious about other life forms.
Here we're sort of in a sort of nice, very shady woodland. It's a nice sunny day. It's certainly warm enough for things to be flying around, but sort of I'm looking around here, and what's lacking here is there really isn't any flowers. There's possibly, there's fallen beech tree, fallen something else rotting there, there's hazel and various other tree species. So there's certainly the sort of woodland part of it. It's a ride, there's a gap through, there's enough sun coming through, it's warm enough, I'd say, but there isn't really any food here for it. So we'll wander around and try and find somewhere where there are some flowers within glades or gaps within the woodland. So that's why what I'd specifically be looking for. And it's
I'm talking about this Wakehurst weekend as an unusual weekend in a sense. What's unusual about it is that I spent so much time outdoors and actually was attentive to these other life forms and life species, the species that kind of surround us.
But yeah, so the bee needs all the resources to be successful. It needs sort of food, shelter, somewhere to raise its young, the same as any species. And the adult bee will only visit the flowers for nectar and for fuel, and then the bee is collecting the protein, the pollen, as protein to feed the young in the nest. So it needs a good supply of the specific flowers for that pollen to raise its young. So that's sort of what we're looking for. As I say, not been here before, never seen this bee before, but we've sort of got clues as to where it might be, what it needs. So you have to sort of wander around starting to think, like, if I am that bee, where am I going to be? What do I need? Yes. What am I looking for? So it's sort of trying to know or trying to connect to the landscape from a sort of bee perspective.
You know, looking for these solitary bees with Richard, they're life forms that I didn't even know existed before that weekend. Loads of species of these solitary bees that to me just look like little flies, but are actually fascinating creatures. And to develop a passion like Richard's and to go looking for them and appreciate through observing them, through recording them, exactly the complexity of their little lives is both humbling and wonderful.
You start to look at the landscape and maybe know the landscape as a solitary bee would. And you're starting to think about sort of microclimate and tiny little bit where it's sheltered, where it's sunny, where all of this. And you start to look at the landscape as in sections of 1 metre by 1 metre rather than standing back and looking at this massive landscape of huge trees, the reservoir, the fields and that kind of thing. So it's a different way of engaging, which is really interesting to encourage people to stop and look at that scale.
To be made aware through being with somebody else that these things are present within the landscape that you're in, and then to be noticing them and to be noticing all of these other aspects of what is there as well, was invigorating and is invigorating.
But one thing that amazes me all the time is just how the natural world, the interconnection of it, how it all fits together and how it all works is just astonishing and absolutely amazing. The story, the things you read about how these organisms exist and sort of make a living is absolutely astonishing. And learn is the wrong word, but I think that it can mean something to us as people to know more about how these things work and how they fit together. And it's awe-inspiring how some of these things survive. For me, I love going out and looking at these things, seeing these things, learning about them, and just sitting and watching them. And I think that's inherent in the human condition.
My name is Becca Roberts and I work on the Nature Unlocked programme at Wakehurst. So Nature Unlocked is one research programme at Wakehurst. There's also tons of stuff going on at the Millennium Seed Bank, but we're the first UK-focused research programme using the landscape itself. We've taken the lab out into the landscape rather than taking the landscape and the seeds into the lab. That's the way in which we have framed Nature Unlocked.
So central to the work that you're doing as Nature Unlocked is this idea of the living laboratory. Can you tell me more about that?
So the way in which we see ourselves as a living laboratory is that we are providing long-term, that's a really key thing, so long-term permanent research stations where we can monitor climate change and biodiversity and the ecosystem services it provides over time and space. To give one example, we are developing a bioacoustics project. So bioacoustics is a way of monitoring biodiversity, and we want to look at what are the best trees for bees, because at the moment around 97% of wildflower meadows, which bees used to rely on a lot, have been lost in the UK. So how can trees provide a habitat like a sky meadow for pollinators when they're flowering? And so the bioacoustics have been installed in the trees across the landscape, so using the landscape as this living laboratory, and they'll be in there for 2 years and they'll be testing which bees are coming to which trees. So that method is being developed here and the equipment is here and it's relatively cost effective. But the data that we're producing and the protocols and the methods can then be scaled. So then we can say to an urban property developer, when you're developing some property, these are the trees that you should be planting for bees to help to provide more food production, more biodiversity in urban areas. So that's kind of an example of how the living laboratory here is like a hub for testing, developing, and then it helps to scale the impact across the UK and beyond.
Okay, so you mentioned the idea of ecosystem services there, and that term is generally used to talk about the ways in which other parts of the natural world provide services
which are useful, if not essential, to humans.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can see how that idea is extremely useful for lots of different reasons, but it's also very human-centered, isn't it? What does nature give to us? How does nature serve us? Do you think there's a danger with ecosystem services that this might squeeze out or hide other ways of knowing the natural world?
Yeah, there's a really great report. I mean, it's long. It's by an organisation called IPBES, and it's all on the values of nature. And they say that this is only one type of value, and it is the one that we are focusing on at Kew. I mean, we call it ecosystem stewardship. We do adopt the kind of biodiversity ecosystem service or natural capital approach, but it is not the only one. And I think in order to have a holistic view of nature, you need to respect everything, the spiritual, the more philosophical, everything has to be respected. And that doesn't mean commodified. It just means I think there needs to be respect of the knowledge. Whenever people come, particularly from Kew Gardens to Wakehurst, so staff members, they say that we have a much gentler way of doing things. Maybe that's because we're not in London, who knows, but it is very easygoing. And I think the energy of Wakehurst as a whole, people are working tirelessly. They're like the ducks paddling furiously underneath the surface. On the surface, all you can see is just grace and enthusiasm. But I think most of Kew as a whole is about understanding, kind of unlocking the magic of plants and fungi for the future of all life on Earth, but it's particularly for the well-being of people. So plants and people have always gone hand in hand for Kew. Yes, we're a science programme that looks at ecosystem services, but if you spoke to any of my colleagues, they would speak about the work that they do and the soils and the bees in the same way they would speak about a human, I would say. They are living, they are breathing, they are respected. That passion definitely comes across. I love it here.
I was reading this book, waiting for somebody at a restaurant. And I knew they were going to be late. They're always late. And they turned up and they asked what I was reading. And I said, with a excitement in my voice, I'm sure, I'm reading about this crazy guy who is, wants to know what it means to be, to live like a badger, to be a badger. He really wants to know what it's like to be a badger, but the closest that he can get, he feels, is to physically try and live like a badger. At least that's a start. And she rather took the wind out of my sail by saying, why on earth would you want to do that? But it's a very good question, really. Why should we be more curious? Why is that beneficial either to us or to anybody else?
I mean, a couple of different reasons come to mind. The first is in terms of the moment that we find ourselves at in terms of ecological crisis. So paying attention to and being curious about these other life forms with whom we share the planet is absolutely crucial at this moment. Robin Wall Kimmerer uses this phrase, the democracy of species. And within that vision of a democracy of species is actually that other life forms also have a voice at the table of what happens to the planet. So the question of, well, how do we invite those other voices to the table? How do we hear those other voices? How do we acknowledge that there are other voices beyond the human that actually have a voice is a vital, vital question. The other aspect is more of a personal nature. The practice of being curious is also, and here I'm drawing on something that Charles Foster speaks about, an exercise in empathy and of exercising the muscles of empathy. And to go on that journey transforms oneself and hopefully will make one a more empathetic person, not only towards other species, but also towards one's fellow humans as well.
The muscle of empathy.
Yeah.
Is a nice phrase. So I feel that we've probably come to the end of this experimental episode of the Ways of Knowing podcast. Should we give the last word to Charles Foster?
Yeah.
Before we do that, thank you very, very much for listening. We hope to make more of these episodes that will cover subjects that run tangentially to the Ways of Knowing themes that we've unpacked here. Information about various texts and authors that have been featured in this episode can be found in the show notes. And if you'd like to get in contact, then we would love to hear from you at info@academicpodcastagency.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to be in your ear sometime again very soon.
So depending on how you do the calculation, between 85 and 95% of our time as behaviourally modern humans, so since the start of the Upper Paleolithic about 45,000 years ago, has been spent as hunter-gatherers. And that's a mode of life which involves acknowledging that the boundary between you and the non-human world is in some ways illusory. The wild world bleeds into you and you bleed into the wild world. That way of perceiving your relationship with the non-human world was necessary for survival. One would only know when the caribou herds were going to arrive and where they were going to arrive if you had the sort of clairvoyant connection with them, which is entailed in this porous relationship with the world more generally. And since that has been the way in which we have been for most of our evolutionary history, I think that is what we at root are. Strip the suit off a Wall Street banker and you have a hunter-gatherer underneath. And that gives me great hope. If that's what at root we are, we can get back there. It's possible. And this seems to me to be the great ecological challenge of the Western world. The great challenge is to live as a hunter-gatherer in a polite terraced house like this. But it's easier than we think.
It's easier than we think.
I think so. Yeah. Because that's what we are.